Today I'm going to be watching this video. It's called Sweden's Surprisingly Private and Free Education. And of course I've learned about different things with regards to Sweden paying high taxes, but one of the benefits of that, having to pay a high tax, is having a good level of education. So this one is interesting as well because it's private and free. So yeah, tell me what you think about this. Tell me what you think about the standard of education in Sweden. How was your schooling for you, your experience? Let's watch.
Let me ask you a question. Which countries would you say have the most extensive and efficient public services in the world? Which are the countries where education, healthcare, and public administration not only cater to everyone, but do it well? And do it spending the right and necessary amount of money? Well, the answer is very easy. The countries of Northern Europe. Countries like Norway, Sweden, or Denmark, which are always presented as well-known success stories, high taxes, and social democracy. But what if I were to tell you that this is not 100% true? What if I were to tell you that there is a lot of legend that is somewhat manipulated concerning the success of these countries? You see, despite the great reputation of Sweden's public services, what would you say if I told you that its education system is largely privately managed? Yes, it is true that for most of its modern history, Sweden has been a country that has relied heavily on state management. For Swedes, it has always been normal for the state to provide services such as healthcare, education, and pensions, without the private sector getting involved. Hence its reputation as a Nordic, social, democratic country. However, at the end of the 20th century, everything changed. This man you see on screen, Carl Bildt, came to power in Sweden as the leader of the Moderate Party, a party that has never played a role in government before, and yet in 1991 won the elections with a plan that completely broke with Swedish tradition. A plan that consisted of cutting public spending, lowering taxes, and liberalizing markets such as energy. But above all, and what interests us most right now, possibly the most groundbreaking measure of this government was the privatization of part of the public education system. Yes, that's right. In fact, that's precisely what this video is about. What exactly did this model of educational privatization consist of? Was privately managed education a success or a resounding failure? What would happen if other countries with fully public systems opened the door to private management? Well, today on Visual Economic, we'll tell you all about it. Stay tuned.
So yeah, it's good to get some context and background to how that actually came into play. So it was like the early 90s. Tell me if you think that's been a success, how you think it differs from just keeping everything public. Tell me, yeah, if you went through this private education, how was it for you?
As we told you a moment ago, the great promoter of school privatization in Sweden was the Moderate Party. This party was something like a mix between liberal and conservative, one more party among the popular European ones. Yes, the same ones to which Ursula von der Leyen also belongs. Well, the Swedish Moderate Party had a great economic role model, none other than Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, along with Keynes, is one of the most influential economists in history. His work on economic policy won him a Nobel Prize in 1976, and today he is recognized as one of the philosophical fathers of economic liberalism. But beyond all this, the curious thing is that he never opposed the existence of public spending or certain social services. In fact, not even Friedrich Hayek or Adam Smith were completely against public services. And another widespread myth is that libertarianism means a complete absence of public services, and that is not so. But let's not get sidetracked. The point is that Friedman was in favor of the state being able to guarantee a decent education to children of all classes and circumstances. However, what he did not agree with was that this education should be provided directly by the state. In other words, he was against public education. But let's see, hold on a minute, can you be against public education but at the same time be in favor of the state guaranteeing education? Isn't that a bit contradictory? Well, no, the truth is that it's not contradictory at all, because one matter is who pays for the education, and quite another, who provides it. And that is exactly where Friedman's proposal for school vouchers comes in. You see, in a traditional public education system, families generally do not have many alternatives when choosing the type of educational model in which they want to educate their children. Public schools tend to follow poorly differentiated patterns of operation, and on many occasions do not adapt to the different needs of very diverse students in order to fully develop their abilities. Of course, in saying this, there are dozens of different public systems, and not all of them are like this. But without a doubt, what almost all public education systems do have in common is that competition between schools tends to be almost non-existent. non-existent. Although I insist, here too there are exceptions, as we have already seen on Visual Politic in the case of Estonia. But as a general rule, the most common thing is that a public school does not care if it has more or less children enrolled. It does not care if the children get better or worse grades. Basically, teachers and administrators are going to get paid at the end of the month anyway. So
Is that true? But I feel like in the UK we have rankings for public schools where like a whole host of different things are measured, and there's just lists of the best public schools and taking into consideration all these different things. So I don't know if that's maybe the case in Sweden where public schools are not compared like that as well, but definitely I feel like, and he sounds British, I feel like that is the case in the UK, that there is those strict comparisons. Every school has these targets they have to hit, and yeah, it just builds the reputation of that school just with regards to the difference between public and private. But I can definitely see with regards to the private way of educating people, it's also good because it will have more flexibility. It doesn't need to stick to that strict curriculum that's probably put out by a public school board and things like that as well. So yeah, let's watch more.
The incentives to improve their service are practically non-existent. And that is precisely what Friedman's school voucher system is intended to address. In the school voucher model, families receive a public subsidy to pay the tuition of the privately managed school of their choice for their children. These are independent schools that receive funding only and exclusively for the number of students enrolled. Because of their independence, these centres have more freedom to specialise and adjust to the different needs that students may have. For example, by focusing their teaching load on the arts, mathematics, or perhaps languages. Don't think you're going to get rid of what you don't like so easily. Be that as it may, the point is that if the centres do things badly, if the children leave poorly prepared, if they had bad teachers or bad facilities, parents will no longer send their children to those centres. And since these centres earn money for the number of students they have, if they have fewer and fewer students, then they will also earn less money and may end up closing. So you may be wondering, what does this all mean? Well, schools and institutes will have much more incentive to do things right, to provide quality education, with computers and facilities in good condition, with teachers trained and adapted to the evolving society. Friedman's proposal is quite interesting, don't you think?
Yeah, I think it's actually very good. It just incentivizes the schools to do better. Like for me personally, the biggest benefit would be it can be more specialised in its teaching. So he's talking about arts and things there. Like if you have a school that's more focused on tech or engineering, things like that, of course you're still going to be learning about all the kind of general subjects, but having more focused classes and subjects, it gives children a chance to like kind of develop from very early, rather than just taking all these general things and being almost, sometimes it can be confusing. These children don't know what they want to do with their lives. If you can put them into a stream from young, it gives them a bit more focus and then makes their job opportunities, it makes them more in demand into specific industries and things like that. Although that does have the drawback of them only being able to have to go into that way of work, but I guess has its advantages and disadvantages.
Well, whether you find it interesting or not, beyond its potential pros and cons, it did seem like a great idea to the moderate party in Sweden in the 1990s. So, as we say around here, no sooner said than done. The new Swedish government set about implementing a school voucher model in Sweden and introduced one of the biggest changes in the country in many decades, the friscola, or in English, charter school. These schools were no longer publicly owned and managed, as had always been the case in Sweden, but were privately owned and managed, regulated in aspects such as price, and financed by the state through school vouchers. You could say they are something like charter schools, but instead of receiving a fixed amount of money, they receive it according to the number of students they have. So how exactly did the school voucher model work out in the Nordic country? Was the practice as wonderful as the theory claimed? Did the Swedes find it a good model, and did it improve their quality of education? Well, let's take a look.
The Stockholm Check.
I want you to take a look at this chart. What you're seeing in this graph is the percentage of pupils who enrolled in independent schools before and after the introduction of the school voucher system in Sweden. At first glance, it doesn't exactly look like the measure was a success. Enrollment rates in private schools did not increase much after the school voucher was introduced. However, this happened because the Swedish population was not used to this type of system. Remember that Sweden is a country with a very strong social democracy tradition, so let's say that Swedes were dubious about the educational quality that these new centres could have. In addition, at the beginning, the model was only applied from elementary to high school. However, look at what happened from the 2000s onwards, when the system was standardized and daycare and preschools were also included. Indeed, the school voucher model, at least in terms of enrollment, was a resounding success. Thousands and thousands of families began to prefer private education to public education. Now, let's be clear, that doesn't mean anything. Even though people started enrolling more and more of their children in the friscola, it's possible those children ended up getting a worse education, or maybe an education that was too biased towards their parents' selfish preferences.
Yeah, I guess that is one way of saying it. Like, I guess you could say it's selfish preference, but you could also say it's like the parents really care about their children in order to give them a bit more structure and focus as well. Tell me if you went to a friscola, or maybe you went to both public and private. Tell me how they differ as well in your opinion. I think it's a good thing. I think even just having the choice of having the public and private is going to increase the level of education, and just having that choice is better. Like, obviously being from the UK, we only really go to public school because private schools just can be very, very costly, so it's not really common for people to go to it. And the public schools are generally quite a decent level of education as well.
And it is precisely here where those most critical of the school voucher model have pointed out that, in reality, this measure worked contrary to the quality of education of students. They argue that since companies only seek profit, they do their best to cut costs, and this worsens the service and the level of education. So the question is there any evidence that this is the case? You may be wondering, did the educational level of Swedes worsen after the adoption of the school voucher model? Well, I'm afraid to say that in theory, we could say yes. Check it out. Armed with the PISA report, a report that measures the educational quality of countries based on students' abilities in a range of subjects. Critics of the school voucher system show time and again how Sweden has been falling in schools since the early 2000s. Yes, just what many of you are thinking. Ever since the school voucher started gaining popularity. Now the question we need to ask ourselves is, what precisely was the reason for this apparent reduction in educational quality? That is, in theory, with the school voucher system, bad schools would have no students, and the incentives to provide better service would be higher than in public schools. But of course, that's only the theory. It's another thing entirely in practice. But why do the two seem to work differently? According to critics, the problem lies in the lack of competition. Even though there is a school voucher, if there is only one school in each town, families have no choice but to send the student to that school. So there is no competition that would make schools improve their offer.
That's true.
You see, part of the problem with the Swedish friscola system is that in order to open a new school, that school has to be endorsed by the state. And not only that, it must also demonstrate that it is necessary to open, and that can be a major barrier to competition. In that sense alone, there are cases in which the public schools themselves maneuvered in a, shall we say, dishonest way to prevent the opening of new free schools, and this could end up reducing their funding. In other words, if private schools become fashionable, the government will allocate less money to public schools, and of course, nobody likes to lose money. Lobby groups and the economy. What can I say? Be that as it may, does this all mean that the school voucher system is a disaster? Should Sweden return to a fully public model after this apparent failure? Well, I'm afraid that it's much more complicated than we have told you, so let's keep going.
The PISA syndrome.
As we've seen, the main argument against the Swedish school voucher is that the PISA reports have substantially worsened since the implementation of this model. However, the truth is that the PISA report collects data from both friscola and public schools. And in fact, public schools represent 86% of the total. That is, this data, rather than a representation of the educational efficiency of the school voucher scheme, is a representation to a greater extent of the decline of Swedish public schooling. However, if this is the case, if the PISA report cannot serve as proof of anything, asking, how can we come to understand the real educational quality of privately managed schools? Well, it was precisely this question that the two Swedish academics, Borlmark and Lindahl, tried to answer in 2015. In an article in which they carefully compared the results of public and friscola schools, they came to the conclusion that the school voucher scheme introduced in 1992 not only did not worsen the quality of education, but caused an improvement of 5% in average scores compared to public schools. And as if that were not enough, they also found that the students from the friscola had more access to university and obtained better salaries during their working years.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I actually thought would maybe be the case, because it's maybe more focused and like in the long term it could be better. But that's quite interesting that even though the PISA score was going down, that actually increased educational level, so it must be quite an increase as well. Tell me if you really see that in Sweden. And tell me just what about the reputations, the stereotypes of the two education systems in Sweden too?
In the same vein, the Swedish Ministry of Labour published a report explaining that a 1% increase in the number of students enrolled in friscola improved average results in both compulsory education and high school for the next 10 years. But are you not convinced enough by these data? Or do you like the PISA data better? Well, if instead of looking at the data from the PISA reports in general, we look at the data by type of school, we will see that between 2003 and 2012, friscola schools performed 8 points higher than public schools. All in all, despite the competition problems that may exist in Sweden, reports and academic studies indicate that the school voucher system was a success. And take note, because not only was it an educational success, but in terms of cost, and at the end of the day, the school voucher scheme meant a funding per student equivalent to 85% of the cost in public education. In other words, school vouchers saved the government money and provided a better and more diverse education to students. In any case, and having seen all this, now it's your turn. What do you think about an education financing system, such as the school voucher? Do you think that a public model that gives more freedom to the centres could be even better? What problems or other advantages can you think of in this type of system? If this model existed in your country, would you take your children to these schools? You can leave.
Yeah, I think if that was in my country, I would definitely give it serious consideration. But as you said there, if public schools had a similar idea where they could be a bit more flexible in their curriculum or what they actually teach to children, that could also be good. But I think the best thing to do is just to have as many different types, give parents as much choice as possible, have the focused private education, have the public school with a kind of structure in their curriculum, and also maybe have the public school with that flexibility as well. The more options, I feel like the overall education level would just be better. But yeah, tell me what you think about this. Tell me if you attended a friscola, what it was like. Do you think it was good for Sweden overall? Thanks.